Some of the content in this recording may be distressing for some audiences. There are links available for Monash Health Services in the description. I wish to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land we are gathered today. I pay my respects to elders past and present.
Welcome to PhD Raw, a series of podcasts developed by the Faculty of Science here at Monash University, which basically focuses on discussing the trials and tribulations of PhD life. And today we'll focus on diversity and inclusion topic of LGBTQI in academia. So before we introduce the speakers for today, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So we are recording this podcast today on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to take the opportunity to also acknowledge First Nations peoples across our continent as the very first scientists of the land. So today I have with me two guest speakers. My name is Bob Wong. I'm from the School of Biological Sciences at Monash University, and I'm joined by Kay and also Tanja. I actually might get Kay and Tanja to introduce yourselves, what you do, before we launch into today's discussion. So maybe beginning first of all with you, Kay.
Sure. Thanks, Bob. My name is Kay Hodgins. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Biological Sciences at Monash. And I study plant evolution, so I'm really interested in how plants adapt to climate change and the DNA changes involved in that adaptation.
Cool. Tanja?
Hi, my name is Tanja Junkers. I'm a professor in the School of Chemistry at the Faculty of Science. And the field of research I'm working in is polymer chemistry, so we look at all kinds of big molecules, going from paint on your wall down to drug delivery for cancer treatment.
Right, and as I mentioned, I'm in the School of Biological Sciences. My field of research is in behavioural ecology, so I'm interested in trying to understand how animals behave from an ecological and evolutionary perspective. So the first question I wanted to ask is an easy one. Why did you get into science, and what was your motivation for doing a PhD? So maybe we'll ask you first, Tanja.
Okay, that's a really simple question for me. I grew up actually in Germany. In the city of Leverkusen, which no one really knows, and it's not bad, but it's the town where the headquarters of Bayer company is. So I grew up in all my childhood completely surrounded by chemistry, and I guess that was quite influential to me. So very early on, I already picked up chemistry and knew I wanted to do that. And I think just generally science interested me because I want to know how things work. Mm-hmm. And science is the logical thing to do then.
Yeah, and when did you first hear about, that you could pursue science further doing something called a PhD? Was that something that you discovered as you were already doing an undergraduate degree?
Yes. It's a quite big cultural difference between Australia and Germany. So when you study chemistry in Germany, it's kind of expected to do a PhD. I would say 90% of graduates do a PhD. Mm-hmm. So actually it would have been odd if I wouldn't have pursued a PhD. Mm-hmm. I know that's quite different in Australia. Mm-hmm. That's where I come from.
Okay. And what about UK?
When I was younger, I always wanted to become an academic, like a professor. So I sort of did really well in school, and it was sort of a natural continuation to pursue a PhD once I actually figured out there was such a thing, I suppose. And originally, actually, I wanted to be an archaeologist, and it wasn't until sort of later in my undergraduate education that I switched into biology. And that was really because of the first year biology class I took at the University of Toronto, where we studied evolution, ecology, and behavior, and it was just really fascinating to me, and I really like sort of evolutionary theory, so I decided to pursue that for my PhD.
It's interesting. I have a very similar story. I actually wanted to be a plant scientist. Oh. So I wanted to be like you when I went into uni, but we had kind of mediocre plant offerings. And I remember in first year biology, sitting in the lecture theatre having these amazing lectures about animal behaviour, and I was totally hooked. But before that, I've always been interested in animals, and I guess you probably were interested in nature as well. So I guess, I kept fish as a hobby and had lots of plants around the house as well. So it kind of seemed like a fitting progression into studying science at uni. But it took me a while to realise that maybe for me I could potentially carry this further into further research through an actual PhD.
It's funny how teachers really influence that, because I remember I really liked biology, but I had sorry, a terrible biology teacher. And that killed it off for me.
Right, but then you had obviously an amazing chemistry.
Yes, I actually did have I had actually several really good chemistry teachers.
Right.
Yeah,
I want to pivot back to the importance of role models a little later within the sort of LGBTQI plus theme of today's podcast, so we'll return to role models in a little while. But all three of us identify as being members of the LGBTQI plus community, and I guess the next sort of question I want us to sort of talk about and reflect upon delves into the challenges that are faced by academics within the LGBTQI plus community. So just wondering if you have some thoughts on what those challenges might actually be, and particularly given the nature of today's podcast, perhaps challenges that junior people might face based on perhaps even our own experiences. So I don't know, Kay, would you like to start off with some thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I think one thing is issues around feeling like you belong, because you might not see a lot of, sort of role models or people that are like you. Certainly when I was a PhD student, most of the professors in the department were cis, white, straight men, and I guess I didn't really see myself reflected there. And that can lead people to feel like they, should go off and do something else if you actually can't see yourself as sort of role modeled, I suppose. Another thing I think that may come up as well is not having necessarily, and this is everybody's experience, but not necessarily having the support from your family, because you coming out can be a really challenging experience, and your family might not actually support you in that, and that can lead to sort of financial distress, or not even having that sort of emotional support, which you kind of need when you're actually pursuing a PhD, because can be a really stressful time. And certainly that unfortunately was my own experience when I was finishing my PhD. I experienced a terrible relationship breakdown, and was outed to my family, and they're quite religious, and so. And I also ran out of scholarship money too, so it was a very difficult time to have all those things happening. And so I could see how a lot of people may not actually be able to sort of continue with facing those types of barriers. I think I was just really lucky to have a really supportive community, a really supportive friend group at that time. So, yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Tanja?
Well, I think what Kay said is very true. Role models and not being able to see yourself. So it was the same for me when I studied. Professors were all male and cis, as far as I could tell, and very heteronormative. So that definitely was a barrier. I mean, I was lucky enough that my financial situation wasn't great as a PhD student, but I didn't have to. I knew where my next meal would come from. But what was for me a really big thing at that time was that I wasn't out at that time, not at all. And you have to deal with a lot of things. And I didn't have that support network, and that was really a big hurdle for me. So that was very invisible to others.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never thought about the. Obviously, it was a big struggle for me as well. I think in terms of sexuality, I never reflected on that until both of you talked about that, because I was thinking more about the academic challenges of PhD life. But of course, having to juggle that, and now reflecting back on my own career journey, dealing with coming to terms with your sexuality and feeling safe to come out to family and friends for many people might actually coincide also with a potentially very stressful part of your academic career when you're trying to do your studies.
Yeah, in some paradoxical way, actually, it wasn't bad for my academic career, because academia became quite of my refuge. Until today, academia is like this non-sexual, non-trans, it's something where it doesn't matter who I am. while in my private life, obviously, it doesn't matter. So my PhD was a way to actually not think about that part.
I was also very conscious about not, when you're still in the closet, one thing that I really struggled with, I think, within that academic environment, sort of looking back, it's actually quite a safe space, or at least for me, thinking back when I was a PhD student, the PhD community was very supportive and close, and there were a few out people within my department, but of course I was still struggling with my sexuality, and I think a real struggle there is trying to be your authentic self and not lying to people, always being really scared to talk about certain topics for fear of being put in a position where you might have to be inauthentic or forced in a situation where you're feeling very comfortable and not quite ready to share with people yet. So, yeah. But yeah, were there particular role models, during your sort of early career stage, that was particularly influential, Kay?
I have to say I didn't really have many sort of queer role models when I was a PhD student. As I said, most of the academics in our department were straight, white, cisgendered men. But I guess when I moved to the University of British Columbia for my postdoc, I was really, really fortunate to work with some amazing academics, including Sally Otto. She's just a fantastic scientist, MacArthur Award winner, but not only was she an amazing scientist, but also an incredible person too. So I think that I was really lucky to experience that type of mentorship, where she created a really sort of warm and welcoming environment where you could feel safe to be, yourself. And also, it wasn't a really competitive environment, so it was a very sort of amazing place to be because of the quality of science, but it was a very cooperative and collegial environment. So I was, really felt that she was an amazing role model. And then when I became an academic at Monash, there were role models in the school. I was very lucky that the School of Biological Sciences already had queer members, including yourself, Bob, and Carlos Groh, and I felt really welcome in the School of Biological Sciences. So,
And what about you, Tanja? I mean, we often hear the saying that you can't be what you can't see. So when did you first see what you could be?
That is a really good question. As a trans person, at least in times of my studies, that was still a very isolating experience. So I didn't know any academic or PhD who was trans. So my role models were outside of that realm. That was more in media, and I had my internet community, which was luckily there for me. And via internet, I knew people, not in my field, but I knew, okay, you can have a successful career with a PhD, even if you're trans. And that really, really helped. So indeed, what you say, if you need to see it to believe it.
Yeah, for me, I didn't even realize what I was missing until I actually saw it. Because I had amazing academic mentors when I was both during my undergraduate and during my PhD. My supervisors were amazing. But it's really heading off to an international conference. I mean, for me, also being of Asian heritage, seeing the first successful Asian academic within my discipline area was such a revelation. And I remember walking home that night after meeting this well-known scientist who I didn't realize was of Asian heritage, and thinking, maybe I can carve out a career as a successful behavioral ecologist. And the same thing happened to me in the LGBTQI space when I went on my postdoc and met a couple of queer scientists, and sort of realizing, that there might be a place for me as well. So I think that was a little bit of a scary thing as well, that sometimes you don't even realize what you're missing until you actually get to see it.
Yeah, and I think you have to look for it. I think once I started really actively looking for it, I found out I'm not alone at all. There's actually quite a few of people who are like me, they just didn't have that visibility back then. And I think that's what's changing nowadays. We see this more and more, and it's beautiful to see that.
Yeah.
And you're perfectly right. I think the first time I saw a queer professor at a conference, that was a big revelation for me.
Yeah. So then moving on to, I guess, what we can do as academics, what do you see as being the kinds of contributions that LGBTQI plus academics can make in terms of activism or advocacy? So,
well, I think activism is something that's very individual. So I think every person has to decide for themselves what they want to do. So I would never say that any queer person has to be an activist. I wouldn't even necessarily classify myself as one. But I do think visibility is extremely important. So my own philosophy is that, for example, in lectures, I don't actually address it really. But I do have my little queer flag on my first slide. I have our "You're welcome" queer flags on my door, so students do know. And I find that really, really important that students who do look for the signs see that very clearly. There is a person, and that person is approachable. And I want to be approachable, even though I'm not going into class and directly say like, this is me, I'm queer. I don't do that.
Yeah, no, I totally get your point. I mean, we have to be comfortable in our own selves in terms of what role we want to play in terms of advocacy. But as you say, even being visible can be profound, right? So
I think visibility is one of the most important things. Yeah.
And your thoughts, Kay?
Yeah, I think that visibility is really important, and I sort of think back to the time when there was a marriage equality vote and how the school gave out those rainbow lanyards, and sort of lots of people in the school started wearing them, and I thought that was it made me feel better about being queer. So even that small sort of thing, I think, did a lot to make people feel more comfortable in the school. So yeah, in terms of activism, I wouldn't call myself an activist either per se, but I've been asked more and more to sort of give talks and talk about my own sort of experience, and it's been a really interesting thing to experience, because you kind of sometimes share a lot about yourself, more so than you would normally in a professional environment or with students. I think it is important because by telling your own story, maybe you can help somebody by being vulnerable. Maybe that's an important opportunity to help other people. But it is, unusual. I think a new experience for me anyway.
I mean, it's so true. I think it is a deeply personal thing to share some of these, in some cases, traumas, right? And to have to relive those kinds of things can be quite full on. But I guess it's also about trying to pay it forward, right? When we reflect on the people that have had an impact, a positive impact on our own lives. For me, I guess, and it'll be interesting to see if you feel the same way, that over time I felt more comfortable. I wouldn't consider myself an activist either, but I sort of go back to your point about just being visible is very important. But I think also as I progressed through my career, and in particular reaching, professorial level, feeling the gravitas that comes with a senior academic role, feeling a bit more comfortable accepting those invitations to speak at forums or to do a podcast like this, because it feels more and more that visibility perhaps also means something, because we are senior academics. And we've got something to show, something to say, with the credibility of having, I guess, navigated a career up to this point in time. Yeah, do you feel the same? Like, have you been more accepting of these kinds of invitations to speak as you've progressed through, or have you always been quite passionate about being visible?
Yes, I agree. The senior academic position really comes with a lot of privileges, and that make a lot of things possible. So in my own little mind, I've always been juggling this thing like, you want to appear competent. And let's face it, if you're part of a minority, you automatically appear less competent to the majority, whether you want to or not. So it has always been a struggle for me to deal with that. And you're perfectly right. Being a senior academic actually is like, it means I don't have to look for promotions anymore. I don't have to prove anymore that I'm a worthy academic. I've done that before. And that gives me opportunities to speak more openly today here. Another thing is that, I mean, as a young academic, you're hunting papers and research grants, and I mean, I still do that. But your life goals change. So today, I think my legacy is, I hope I will have a legacy in science, but I think nowadays my legacy in influencing students and actually being visible, being there, trying to be a role model has maybe even the higher impact long term.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think some of the most meaningful things that I've done in my life has been actually speaking at like the queer and science events and talking about my own personal experiences. And the same sort of story, like when I was younger, I was really focused on, getting that PhD, getting an academic job, and like publishing well. And now I really try and focus on what I love about my job. Like, I love doing science, but I also have this wonderful opportunity to maybe give back in some ways to the community, through like education, through mentorship, and through engagement, doing podcasts or like this, or speaking at queer events. So yeah, it's pretty awesome.
So why is inclusivity important?
Well, I think there's sort of two main answers to that question. The first is, diversity is important from the perspective of an organization, right? So there's lots of research to show that being inclusive and having diversity can enhance productivity of an organization. Say, you could imagine it being really important in science when you have different perspectives in the room, then maybe you can actually ask more interesting questions and come up with like more interesting sort of research. But for me, the answer that's most important for me is the rights-based argument, right? Because it's just the right thing to do, right? Why should we be living in a society that is unjust and not fair, right? Where we're allowing certain people to have privileges and power and rights and not others just because of this historical effect. And I think that one of the things that I want to do is try and help sort of reduce the barriers for different groups of people that have been historically prevented from participating in academia. So,
No, I fully agree. That's a really good answer. The only thing I might want to add is you can break the society question down also to a more private space. So, like in my own research group, for example, with PhD students. I want to be inclusive simply because I want people to feel good. I don't want to exclude people. So if I'm working with someone, I want them to be able to be themselves, and that's a driver as well.
So if you could give some advice to your younger self, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself when, at that sort of PhD stage of your career? Any sort of parting advice to your younger self?
I would probably say be more open-minded. I don't think I was close-minded back then, but today I realized that, I wasn't aware of a lot of things, which was probably mainly due to the environment I grew up in. But I was vaguely aware of LGBTIQ plus rights because I was myself in there, but I knew very little about racism, for example, which I learned much, much later. So I wish I would have educated myself more back then already and just be more open generally.
And Kay, what would you tell your PhD self?
A lot. Probably not very much I want to share right now, but anyway, I think I would say, really reflect more about what you want to contribute with your life, right? Like really think about what you want to spend your time doing, right? And how you want to make an impact. So what do you find meaningful, right? What do you want to, what do you find valuable, and try and really focus on that. And then if you love what you're doing, then it's never a waste of time. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. It's a really difficult question to answer. I guess it's very unfair of me to ask it of both of you, because I guess all of the struggles kind of make us into who we are today. And I remember doing this leadership induction a few years ago, and the facilitator was asking, what is it that you bring to your role that no one else can bring? And I couldn't really answer that question at the time, but sort of reflecting on it 6 months later, I sort of realised, what the facilitator was really asking us to reflect on is to think about bringing all of ourselves, because that's something that's unique to each and every one of us. So in some respects, changing that course, those struggles, I wonder, sort of reflecting back, whether that would make us into perhaps a different person. And I'm pretty happy with where I've ended up in this journey so far. So I actually don't know what I would tell my younger PhD self. Maybe that everything will be all right, because I guess there were times laying in bed when the tears were flowing, especially around the sexuality aspects of it. So not so much dealing with the professional side of things, that if I could reassure myself then that things will work out, that would be probably the only thing that I'd probably tell myself.
There. Now thinking about it after hearing your answers, I mean, it's a it almost hurts to say it, but be kind to yourself. I think that's probably also one thing I should tell my younger self. Everybody should be more kind to themselves, and we all know that, but we hardly ever do it.
All right. Yep. Any final words from either of you? Okay, excellent. Well, thanks so much, Kay and Tanja, for your time. And I hope this podcast is valuable for those of you watching and listening to it. We did cover some sensitive materials. It's worth pointing out that there are support services available here at Monash if you're finding any of the content a little bit heavy going, and we'll provide links to some of those resources attached to the podcast once that's made available. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.